I would really say that we are more probably going to go back probably by about 2 or 3 years. So therefore, we might probably need about 2 to 3 years, at least in industry terms. But at least we are going to be 10 years ahead in emission terms. So what I do believe in, and I've been promoting this 3D concept. I'm a very clear believer in the 3D concept, which talks about the 3Ds: decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization.
That was right from the middle of this week's episode. Hello and welcome to yet another episode on the Mission Chunya podcast. So, wherever you are at this point in time, hope you are taking the required precautions to keep yourself and your family safe amidst the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. No matter what business you are in, there is definite uncertainty surrounding the current situation. For someone like me working in the cleantech space, the situation is no different. All the conversations I have been having with my industry colleagues from around the world over the last few months, the discussion is just around COVID-19 at this point in time. But times like these bring out the best out of people, so let's be optimistic about that. And thanks for all the feedback for the previous episode, which was the first in this mini series that we are having on the podcast around COVID-19. As promised on this episode, you will get to listen to another great conversation surrounding the uncertainties of COVID-19 in the sector. Today's guest is Vish Iyer. Vish is an industry expert and an entrepreneur himself. Vish is currently pursuing key engagements centered around the theme of sustainability, spanning new mobility, logistics, infrastructure, healthcare, and renewable energy. He does it through his boutique advisory practice, TTouche, that is, touche preceded by a T, where he serves as a partner and co-founder. Vish is another industry colleague whose work I have been following for a few years now, and I have got to know him first while he was working with global renewable energy developers prior to his shift into entrepreneurship. He has been instrumental in building a large portfolio of renewable energy projects and also allied business verticals like energy storage and EV charging in his previous roles. A widely recognized voice in the energy space, and he has always come across as an evangelist for the clean tech transition. And I'm sure you will feel his passion while listening to the chat that I had with him. So without further ado, let's dive into this week's conversation. Hello Vish, welcome to the Mission Chunya podcast.
Hey Girish, thanks for having me on this podcast.
Vish, for most part of your career, for a long part, you have led businesses, you have led business development teams, and you're focused on developing new technologies and projects, predominantly in the clean tech space. If I have to say, you were probably an entrepreneur in a way. So, is COVID-19 the biggest challenge that you've faced in your career so far?
I think to simply put, COVID-19 is not just a one challenge that anybody's faced. I think it's probably the biggest challenge of everybody's life. I think the situations are not very different for me or for any other guy on the street. I think this crisis has been one big leveler for everyone. So whether you are on your own, whether you are actually employed, or you're in the process of getting employed, or any other form of professional association. I think all classes and segments, even the informal labor, so to speak, in India, I think everybody's been equally affected by this crisis, and I would say that I'm not any different from any of the other classes that have been affected from what's happening all around us.
That's perfectly well put. Yes, as you rightly said, everyone's affected and everyone's affected in a different scale, but everyone's definitely affected. Now, if we were to look back in this scenario compared to where we were in the last few years, especially considering the clean tech sector, the last few years, definitely around the world, the clean tech projects and mostly clean tech, renewable energy, and of late, even e mobility broke records. Year on year records were definitely broken. The growth story was phenomenal. So, with this happening, every industry is affected, as you would say, but will this impact the clean tech growth story for a long term?
So let me start by going back to the good days, right? We'll have to basically see this from the period perspective between the last financial crisis and this particular pandemic, in the last 10 years, I think the world has moved at a very fast clip, especially on renewable energy and new technologies such as electric vehicles, for example. The renewable energy adoption increased, I'd say, significantly starting the last decade, somewhere around 2010-11, when you had the first few gigawatts installed in almost every country. And the very famous event of the polysilicon price crash occurred, which actually gave rise to a large Chinese domination as far as solar energy is concerned all through the last decade. We've also seen in the same period between 2008-9 and about 2020 massive cost drops of more than 70%, price reductions in basic wind and solar technologies. We've also seen how both these renewable technologies have actually left grid parity somewhere in the dirt in mid 2017, 2016, 2017, perhaps. In the same period, we've also seen electric vehicles and e-mobility businesses take shape. If viewers, listeners, and I think yourself remember, 2008, 9, 10, Tesla was a big thing at that point of time. You also had companies such as GM with its Bolt, long back, and I think Nissan over the interim period take shape as electric vehicle manufacturers as well as leading automakers in that category. The Chinese auto giants obviously came into the picture in the last 5 to 7 years, and they've been leading the charge, much expectedly. But all of this was helped by the rise of the good old lithium-ion battery. I mean, that's a technology that all of us have known for probably more than a century. We've been using them, in our in our mobile phones for at least the last 20-25 years. The key development that we saw in lithium ion over the last decade was that while the cost of the lithium ion cells fell about 85%, the energy density increased threefold, right? So that actually was a significant event. I'd probably say epochal in terms of both renewable energy, clean tech, as well as transportation innovation by itself. As now battery costs are somewhere around the $200 per kilowatt hour range, and if you go by reports by the big research firms like BNEF and the rest, you are going to see battery costs reach somewhere around $50 to $70 a kilowatt hour in less than 10 years. The other thing that was good and that also led to a lot of resurgence in some of these areas was clearly the emergence of novel technology solutions such as big data, machine learning, and we also saw the ushering of the artificial intelligence age. All this, besides deeper application as well as ever improving accuracy of technologies such as lidar, I mean, which is now very famous for autonomous vehicles. And these have been much anticipated confluences. There was this big anticipated confluence spoken about by the Silicon Valley maybe much earlier than a decade ago, of several industries intersecting with software. And I think the emergence of some of these technologies actually led us there. So, in a situation where companies like Google, for example, is now one of the largest autonomous vehicle leaders in the whole segment, like through Waymo. So we've seen this big growth, this big shift. Closer home, if you talk about India, India has seen a wave of EV startups. We've seen a wave of business models emerge, not only in the electric vehicle space, but even in general, the renewable energy space through the IPP phenomena starting 2010. It was first wind and then solar in a very big way. But we do stand at a very large threshold of some of these installations. EV took off in India, I think, about maybe a little earlier than 3 or 4 years back, leading to a score of pioneers, as we know by now. In the EV fleets, we already had aggregators like Ola. We also had specific industry players in the EV fleet segment like Lithium, Blue Smart, and so on and so forth. Plus a plethora of EV charging and battery servicing providers. So I think there has been an all-round innovation. There has been, I'd say, all-round growth and adoption. Auto majors like Maruti and Hyundai, especially, the number one and number two in India, they've committed to their first vehicles. If all would have been okay, I'm pretty sure it still is for some of these companies from their model launches perspective. But I think if all is okay, most of these companies were supposed to come out with their first few vehicles this year, or maybe start of next year. We also saw large foreign-owned auto majors like MG, for example, owned by the Chinese, get off the block on the electric vehicle bandwagon last year. What was also interesting in the period in the last 10 years, as far as EV is concerned, and also the last 3 years specifically for India, is that there was a large public adoption of electric vehicle phenomena. And I think in India, it started off from the e-bus market, the electric bus market, which was actually promoted by the FAME policies and some state transport corporations, which were, I'd say, pioneers in that space, leading to certain players like BYD Electra, Tata Motors, and Ashok Leyland taking market leadership. Of course, I think with the pandemic around and with this whole question hanging around public infrastructure, there is a lot of rethink around how these companies will look for the strategies, including, I'd say, the state transport corporations. But I think going back to the solar and the wind growth, we've seen a growth as far as solar is concerned from almost zero to about 34 gigawatts in India in less than 10 years. And especially in the last 5 years, we're talking about solar growth of about 10x, which I think was evident in the latest details released by the MNRE. Wind has been slightly over 14 gigawatt in the last 5 years, but nearly 37 odd gigawatts, as far as cumulative installs. So we're talking about almost 50 gigawatt nearly installations of solar and wind in India, in a country that still predominantly runs on fossil fuels, right? So I think we've turned a corner. We've actually really come a big way. What also helped, I'd like to spend maybe a minute more to speak about some of the global events that actually also helped. I think the Paris Accord in 2015 was also a very watershed event in terms of getting a lot of signatories to conform to the already existing or understandable commitments towards the reduction of emission norms, as well as meeting certain targets in terms of temperature rise, or rather controlling temperature rise across the globe. On the flip side, I think you know, coming back to India, we invested into about 42 gigawatts of fossil. I think when we talk about all the good things that happened, it's also important we talk about some of the things that should have been done better. I think on the flip side, we would still went ahead and invested into about 42 gigawatts of fossil fuel power plants, even in the last 5 6 years with the present dispensation. And the other significant development in the last 6 to 7 years was also a nearly defunct gas power sector because of continued, let's say, turmoil on the gas pricing policies. Now these are very highly regulated industries and therefore significantly dependent upon government intervention. A most understated point from whatever has happened in the last 10 years, again talking about India, what I believe is the biggest understated point is the diesel power dropping from almost a gigawatt and a half to less than 500 megawatts in at least the last 5 years. So I think what we've done is be going beyond all the talks. We've at least controlled the worst form of emission in India, right? I mean, there were so many industries burning diesel all through. I think in the last 5 to 7 years, we've got a hold on that. We've actually not increased, but rather come down on diesel installation. And I think the trend is there to continue. I think this trend is going to definitely be continued even post pandemic. There is much more that we could and we need to do as far as increasing renewable energy share, which I think presently stands at about 23%, but we're expecting it to go to 50% near term. But I think these times that we are in right now has really shown us that we need to worry about climate change being the next possible nature imposed emergency. So I think we need to be really prepared for that.
I mean, that's a phenomenal summary, Vish. I mean, no, I don't think I could have put it better, but it's a comprehensive summary of not just India, but the global scenario. And most of the points that you did mention are really valid because, I mean, a decade earlier, we would have never thought that solar or a wind could break the grid parity or solar module prices going below $1 per watt peak could be possible. Not just that, even the lithium ion batteries going the prices they are going. So, all these are phenomenal success stories in its own way. And I mean, at the same time, people would then say all this happened because there was a significant demand uptake globally. And just because the demand was there, there was a lot of manufacturing and the scale was possible. So everything kind of came together, is what we can say. But now, with this pandemic outbreak, people, when we generally talk to industrialists, and I'm sure you would agree that people are not sure about how this demand uptake will continue. So, if there is a jolt to the demand from the supply side, from the other ancillary services, will this take a hit? Or if this takes a hit, will we again be pushed back a few years behind? Because we signed aggressive targets, as you mentioned, the Paris Climate Agreement was an aggressive target because countries voluntarily committed to that. Now, with this all this happening, will this COVID-19 pandemic push us a little few years behind?
Very good question. I think I'd say that we're definitely we need to consider what's going to delay, the whole commitment. I'm pretty sure the not the pandemic, but I think the after effects are going to be something that are going to really influence how the signatories actually meet their commitments. I would really say that we are more probably going to go back probably by about 2 or 3 years. So therefore, we might probably need about 2 to 3 years, at least in industry terms. But at least we are going to be 10 years ahead in emission terms. If you look at this statement, you'll have to look at it very carefully. What I'm saying is that from industry terms, we'll probably go about 2 to 3 years back. So as an industry, we'll probably need about 3 more years to catch up. But as far as emission norms or emission targets are concerned, I think there is a chance that we might probably leapfrog. If you look at what's happened right now, and I think BNEF came up with some of these numbers very recently, there is enough evidence out there in the external world that there is a 20% drop in emissions early this year because of lockdowns, and also because of, I'd say, restricted commercial activity, economic activity because of the lockdowns. Now, if you asked anybody in the world to throw a dart on what percentage they believe emissions would go down by in the next 5-10 years, people would probably talk about 2% or 5% or something like that. But to see a 20% drop in emissions in just about one quarter is phenomenal. So I think what we've shown ourselves is that we can surprise. If I go into some of the data that I've seen recently, BNEF again comes up with a number that solar this particular year, is the targets for solar is cut down from their perspective to about a low of 108 to a high of 143 gigawatt installations. Earlier, the number was 121 at a lower level and 152 at a higher level. So they're basically talking about knocking off 10 to 12 gigawatts from that high end and low end number. If you ask me, the BNEF numbers are still looking very optimistic at the moment because the full impact of the pandemic and the aftermath is yet to be assessed. And I think these are numbers that had come out probably in March. So the full reality and the ground reality in India is that most firms are almost looking at 2021 for any sort of return to normalcy in business. So we're not expecting great happenings in 2020, but probably gradual return back to work. And 2021 is where all the firms, at least in the country, or most of them that I spoke to at least, are looking at some sort of semblance of normalcy or return. While for the wind, again, if you go by some of the numbers that have come out because of the pandemic, people believe that there are downside risks to about 74.5 gigawatt target globally that needs to be achieved or was on track to be achieved, I would say, until last month. I think we'll expect very little new actions globally because everybody's busy funding the pandemic and the related economic crisis. Although I think wind does look much better than solar because of longer and tighter delivery and build cycles. I think that's something which I think BNEF also opined. So I do believe that since there is a finite period and it's a long period for sourcing your turbines, for placing your orders, and I think if you see the fact right now, almost all of the wind manufacturers, especially the largest ones, they're all running their books full, and most of them actually have orders right up to 2022. I think from the wind manufacturer or the turbine supplier perspective, business looks okay. But I think even from the delivery and build cycle, it's not too bad because a project usually takes about a couple of years for people to build. Whether it's offshore or onshore is a different matter. There would be short-term pressures on equipment supply chains, which is, I'd say, very, very normal in such a scenario. But I think long-term, the search for demand could continue. I think you were right on that particular point that there could be a sudden loss of demand. So I think there would be some loss of demand. How much of that loss would be, global? How much of that loss would be local? Whether it be a big or a small loss, I think is something that we'll probably need to see with time. But one thing is pretty sure that all the governments would be busy allocating resources to healthcare, and I think also to prop the economy back into shape because I think saving the jobs are absolutely more important and crucial. So I'm not really sure if governments would really, or you can't even blame them actually for not focusing too much on RE development funding, at least in this particular year. 2021 might be different. They might probably come back into shape. But this particular year, the immediate 6 months, 8 months, you're going to see a lot of governments focusing on what is more priority. Let me also talk about some of the other industries. If you talk about auto industry, for example, which is very crucial for the EV growth, I think the auto industry typically follows the health of the economy. So when you have a great economy, when you have a bull market going on, you see the auto industry going up. When you see the economy, not doing great, you see the auto industry doing okay. I mean, it's not at its glory. So you are going to see that kind of a pattern where the auto industry would probably follow, the health of the economy, and recessions would mean it, and it's already shown in numbers, whether it's China, Europe, or even in India, that the auto sales would fall anywhere between 10 to 40% in such recessions. It's already witnessed from the Feb March numbers. I'm just referring to the same background. So this is going to be, it's going to be as normal as any other recession in terms of demand drop, and that's supposed to be expected. Going to the energy storage side of things, from renewable energy again, I think I think you're going to see a big hit because it was a very infancy stage industry. Energy storage itself, I think, has probably seen only about 3 to 4 years of growth, real growth, so to speak. It was already there for the last 10, 15 years. People have been experimenting it on several, I'd say, first up pilot projects and, say, initial projects. But I think in a real big way, in terms of doing gigawatts and gigawatts of installation, I think it only kicked off in the last five years or so. What we're going to see in 2020 is that the energy storage installation numbers cumulatively globally is going to go back to the numbers that we probably had in 2018. So we're going to go back, and this is one of the reasons why I said as an industry we'll probably go back about 2 3 years. We are again going to go back to that less than 4 gigawatt, less than 3 to 4 gigawatt kind of range globally of battery installation, which is technically a drop of 20%. Now, again, the asterisks on all of these presumptions or all of these forecasts are that all of these forecasts have been made when the pandemic started, right? And nobody knows when it's going to end. Nobody knows when economies are going to go back into work again. So when we say a drop of 20% right now, it's probably foresight. Hindsight, we'll probably have to come back and see how these numbers pan out. And these are again early estimates. So a lot also depends, as we all know, on some of the Chinese supply chains, whether it's for clean tech, whether it's for storage, or again for electric vehicles. I think the Chinese supply chains are crucial because the world is, I'd say, honestly over dependent to a certain extent on some of those supply chains there. Going to the financing side of things, that's where supply, and as far as supply is concerned, supply of money is concerned, we do see bottlenecks in new VC investments in this space. So GTM, Green Tech Media in the US, came up with some numbers just as recently as a month back, where they spoke about potential consequences of current scenario, which would probably lead to reduction in VC interest, or reduction at least in VC money that could be available to plow into new things like grid edge, energy storage, proliferation into AI for energy. All of these are going to be, a little bit of a question mark at the moment until people figure out things in the next couple of quarters. And therefore, I think we believe it will be a much larger hit because if there is some sort of a bottleneck for innovation, which I think is what VC investment was promoting, it can actually take the industry back, in terms of year multiples. I call them year multiples because then you're not talking about time in terms of quarters. Every quarter of VC-led investment or VC-led innovation in the world is usually leading into multiple years of gains for the industry. So that's why I coined this word called as year multiples. So if a VC investment is hit in these spaces, especially the proliferating new technology space, it affects innovation, which has year multiples for any industry and for energy, especially, and for EV. We must be more concerned about not 2020, I would say, because 2020, as we see, is already progressing right now. What I'd be more concerned about is actually the pipeline for 2021 and 22, because if you know the energy sector, and by now you know it very well, that most of the deal making takes long cycles. So energy sector is peculiar in that the profits are supernormal like any other industry, but then the time that's taken to a customer acquisition or to create a deal is usually more than a year, year and a half, or even 2 years. So in case of wind projects, for example, it's probably the highest. Solar is equivalent in terms of figuring out how you can carry out these multiple site visits, figuring out what site is good, getting all the grid connects in place, and so on and so forth. So RE in general is a long development cycle. Energy storage is nothing low. If you look at US, for example, energy development cycles for utilities are typically a couple of years. Right, a tender comes in today, it probably gets awarded, let's say, in 2 years' time, or maybe can start work in 2 years' time. So I think what we should be more concerned about is the pipeline for 21, 22, and more so for utilities and for CNI sites, which actually require a lot of on-site visits, because this is an industry where you depend on travel, where you depend on going to the site and figuring out, what the locality looks like, and is it really worth an investment, whether you're a private equity player or an utility or a solar developer or a wind developer. You need to understand what your sites are, because that's what you're going to invest into. And I think that is probably going to take some time to come back to normalcy, because people expectedly would be afraid, to travel for a period of time. I'd say, therefore, going back to my initial statement, that in industry terms, I see us back by about 2 to 3 years. Probably we need to catch that 2 3 years, catch up with that 2 3 years later, very quickly, as much as we can. But in terms of emission norms, we've already achieved much more in the first quarter of this year. And even if everything goes back to normal, all the transportation starts running back at normalcy, I think we still are expecting that we would be around that 5%, emission drop that we would have seen by the end of 2020. So I think this year itself has shown that we can have a big feather on the Earth's cap if we really think well. On the upside, coming to the we've spoken a lot about the flip side. Now coming to the upside, I believe people will get hugely sensitive about consumption, of energy. Now that everybody is, holed up in their homes, and people are aggressively trying to use work from home for most of their work, for office, for business activities, it's also leading to a certain level of consumption increase on the residential side. I mean, typically for most utilities, and I think I'm talking about India, but I think this is extrapolatable to almost every country globally. The residential demand is maybe about 20-30% of the overall utility demand that's served. Now we've seen that this really is up, and the industrial demand has gone down. But even within the residential demand itself, what you've seen is that homes have started using more energy. ACs are on even during the days, because people have to do their work, especially if it's people who are missing their offices. You have, even if you have fans, even the fans are running almost in all the rooms. If you're not at work, you'd probably keep them. If you're at work, you'd probably keep them off. So there is an increase in energy consumption, which people are worried about. They may or may not be consuming, but they are really sensitive about how this is going to take shape. The other thing that's also going to be spurring this particular characteristic is also the fact that people are not really sure about the employment scenario down the line. So therefore, the savings mindset starts coming in into the general public at this point in time. So what I do believe in, and I've been promoting this 3D concept. I'm a very clear believer in the 3D concept, which talks about the 3 Ds: decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization. Right? The 3 Ds are definitely going to percolate a lot more in this scenario. You're going to see digitization take over, which we've already seen. Utilities are realizing the importance of being on the cloud as opposed to reading meters on premises in such scenarios. We also saw that recently with some of the large utilities trying to do that actively when this lockdown is underway. So I think that is something that is going to take a very large shape during this period. And I think going back to your question, I do think the COVID-19 will have an impact on the growth. I've explained some of the cases, some of the areas in my analysis as to how this impact can be seen differentially on different sectors and on different segments. And I do expect on industry terms to go back maybe about a couple of years, but I think on emission norms perspective, we'll probably be a year ahead from here on.
I like the couple of ideas that you did bring up both in the discussion, Wish. One is, of course, the ideas of how industries are there. Like, for example, industries are falling behind by 3 years, and the good news of emissions probably leapfrogging the emission targets. So, that one and the 3D concepts are really very interesting ideas or very interesting perspectives to put the entire situation into one place. So, those are really good points. But in the conversation, you did also mention that there are other major factors that we need to consider. One is, of course, the job loss, the financing for the new startups, VC funding for all the startups will fall down. And the third important thing is the saving mindset of the people, because people anticipate that a lot of uncertainty will be there in the sector, jobs, and every uncertainty will lead them to be more conservative, which again is not going to benefit the economy because the demand will be very low overall. I'm sure from an India's perspective, I think we were facing this for the last couple of years as well. Now, all these points kind of put us back a decade earlier, or more than that, 2008-9 crisis. So now looking back in these two scenarios, the situation of clean tech in 2020 as against the 2008-9 scenario, as you rightly said in the earlier part of the conversation, renewable energy is in a better position to kind of face this challenge. So, but in terms of the recovery rate, what is the best way to recover from this crisis compared to the earlier one?
So absolutely, there's no doubt about we being in a better position than 2008 and 2009. I think let's help our listeners see this from two perspectives. I think from the industry point of view, we are possibly in the best place. We have gigawatts of yearly experience of installations on the RE and the clean tech side for over a decade, which is definitely going to help. I think the experiential learning that we've accumulated over the last decade is really going to help us tide over, the crisis in a certain manner. Now, all the tools, the learnings, the skills that have been gained as an industry from 2008 onwards is going to be invaluable in terms of fighting this crisis. The second point, as far as industry point of view is concerned, is that many zero carbon technologies were mostly expensive. If you go back to 2008, we again were talking about the polysilicon crash a while ago, which actually led to, say, larger adoption of solar. Now, most of these technologies, whether solar or wind, were super expensive back then, right? I mean, I remember days of solar when we were buying solar modules at roughly about $4 per watt. Though right now we're talking about less than $20 cents, right? So we're talking about a major crash right now. So I think we've had many of these zero carbon technologies which were super efficient, which are super efficient and super cost efficient as well right now, which were expensive back then. While renewable energy, electric cars, all of them needed subsidies to be competitive at that point of time. Today, they don't need those subsidies. Honestly, most of the RE and clean tech growth that you're seeing right now is subsidy-less growth. So at least it's no more expensive, even if it's not very subsidy-led in some of the developing nations, and it's not more expensive than the traditional fossil-based technologies. So that basically means with limited budget resources, it's still possible to achieve much more if the liquidity in the sector and if the financial cycle in the sector is kept intact. We could also achieve a lot more if the investments in spaces like clean energy, electric car charging stations is sustained. Even if it doesn't grow, at least if it's sustained, I think we could still tide over the crisis to a greater level. And if we could make some trade-offs between economic and environmental considerations, I think those could also help a lot in terms of tiding back from this crisis. Now, I think because if you look at all these scenarios from the industry point of view, I think it's clear as a daylight that if all things are equal, we can surely aim for stratosphere in the next 6 to 7 years or maybe even 10 years from where we stand. I think solely from the experiential standpoint and the resilience of the industry itself. From the regulatory and financial point of view, we might probably be worse off compared to the last recession. I think this is something which is understandable. I see mainly three reasons for this. I think one is that this pandemic probably has been a pandemic which is operated in perfect equilibrium, meaning that this has actually flattened financial fuel tanks of all countries alike. I mean, previous recessions used to be starting off in one country and having sort of a ripple effect in some of the other countries or some of the other continents, but this one basically has had the same effect in almost all the countries globally. Everybody's out there announcing the stimulus package. Everybody is It's basically like a playbook that the countries are following, as if everybody was taught to do the same thing, right, in a crisis. So that I think is one key reason. The second is regulatory improvements, and there is a real risk of regulatory improvements slowing because we've now got to catch up on economy, we've got to catch up on healthcare, something that we've ignored for ages. I think healthcare is something we realize now that was underinvested, was also ignored to a greater extent, and I think for the same reason. And while we're talking about this on the flip side, for the same reason, I also believe and I'm hopeful that the regulators on the clean energy as well as the electric vehicle side will learn from the healthcare experience and not leave clean energy and electrification of transportation in lurch. I'm pretty sure. I think that will also be a consequence. The third reason that I have in mind, for this entire thing from the regulatory and financial sector standpoint, they said the emerging markets would be worst hit. And I think if you saw what transpired in the last decade, growth in clean energy actually shifted from, let's say, developed markets to developing markets. A lot more money, a lot more liquidity, and a lot more debt was available for emerging markets to use. So emerging markets at the moment, as we all know, are the worst hit. Because of, not because of pandemic as much, but more so because of the economic crisis that follows. This is also going to probably have a knock-on effect on DFI funding, which is critical, which is a prime source for clean energy promotion in most of the countries. So if you look at continents like Africa, if you look at some of the some of the countries in Asia, especially East Asia, where the countries' GDPs are not that great, or the situation economically is not that good, but the countries still have to meet some of these norms. It's basically DFIs that have helped them do that, through IFC run programs or ADB run programs, or let's say AIIB run programs. Now we're probably going to see some sort of effect on those programs, and these could also deflate, let's say, subsequently utility auctions and new innovation projects in some of these continents. So from a regulatory and a financial standpoint, as I spoke, we'll probably be worse off compared to the last recession. That said, I think regulations, in my view, also follow interest and demand in the market from investors. So while we say that it's easy to sit and observe, I think if the investors' liquidity and deal making is back in the system, now I don't know when it's going to be back, but let's assume it's back in 2021, because that's the earliest that we can see a lot of action. I think this piece can take care of itself. Now, if you're able to make a remarkable comeback, and especially an economic comeback, chances of which, honestly, at this point of time, is not better than getting a tail on a coin toss. We should probably see an uptick all across. How do I see that happening? I'll probably explain that separately for EVs and for renewable energy. In two quick points. For EV, for example, and this is dwelling into the business models to a certain extent. For electrification of transportation, especially led by fleets, while car pools as a business model might probably suffer in near term. We are already seeing that, right? In most countries that used Uber, the usage of Uber has gone down probably about 90-95% in the last couple of months. So you probably see some sort of hit on some kind of fleet models, but on some of the other fleet models of electrification of transportation, for example, car subscription is still doing well. So if you see Zoom Car and a lot of other subscription-based models in India, as well as the world, some of the Avis companies in car subscription, all of them are doing okay-ish at the moment. Some of the lease models, which work for fleets, will also ensure that the fleet economics still work well for EVs to a certain extent. Now, yes, there is this point about oil being so cheap and super low priced right now, that everybody has this question about whether EVs will come back into the fray. I would believe that EV or electrification of transportation is already a done deal. Done deal in the sense that people have already witnessed, what they're going to gain out of adopting this, and I don't think it's a lifestyle choice. So my view, I think this is still going to stick. It's not going to be like the 1900s when Ford invented a diesel or a fuel car, and electrification stopped thereafter. I don't think that's going to be the case now. Going back to the business models again, I think the one big area where I'm going to see the fleet models remain neutral is going to be the commercial fleets, because commercial fleets are typically for businesses such as logistics, or for typical transportation between different parts in a city or between cities. Now I think most of the focus is within the city, which is intracity. I think that could probably see neutrality, simply because it's used for majorly transporting goods and not people. So you have to be really concerned about contracting a virus if you have to be traveling yourself. But I don't see that to be a chance on commercial EV fleets, especially which is used for goods and for logistics, right? So that could probably see a mass uptick, in the commercial fleet space. Now, the area that looks most crucial, and for the growth of EVs, not only in India but I think for also some of the other Asian countries, is going to be the two-wheeler and the three-wheeler adoption network. I think we could probably see significant adoption in two-wheelers, fleets again. I'm really believing that fleets will still keep the economies up, because you may not be able to achieve those fleet economics, if you're actually buying the vehicle by yourself, as a consumer, because my belief is you're going to have a smaller purse to operate with post this pandemic. But I think fleets will definitely keep the industry up, and I think they are also going to lead to new innovation and new models post this pandemic. I think this is a sign that's also evident from a lot of funding that's been raised recently in the startup space. So you've seen a lot of two-wheeler fleet startups raise significant amounts of money even in the middle of the pandemic in the last couple of months. For the renewable sector or for the clean energy side of things, what I feel is that there is this one area which will remain very active and which will grow throughout the crisis, and I think that's going to be the utilities as well as the pay-as-you-go offerings from innovative energy companies, focusing on digital energy or digitizing energy rather closer to homes. In my opinion, I think the true era of decentralization of energy will kick in. That as people shun offices for work from home, at least for a shorter time, if not for a longer period of time, and they start getting more curious and sensitive about their energy consumption and patterns around that, it will lead to solar finding its true purpose, I believe, finally. While grid edge technologies like smart meters, DERs, demand response, all of that will proliferate. And I think both these parts of the wheel, which is basically both these stakeholders, the utilities as well as private companies, will benefit from this. One example of that is already visible. If you look at India, for example, we've already seen EESL start off in partnership with the NIIF, the sovereign fund in India. They've already started off this massive smart meter digitization campaign right across the country. So they've started this big smart meter business,
Yes.
and I think that's going to be very, very crucial in months and days to come. It's going to basically ensure that we don't have to move out of our homes. So right now, my Discom sends me a message and tells me that either I go down and take the reading from my meter, or they'll just bill me on average price, which is probably not the most efficient way of doing business, in my opinion. But I think this is probably going to change with digitization of metering. And I think digitization of metering also has other impacts. I think it's probably the breeding ground for innovation on grid edge, for innovation on DER, for a lot of other business models that you could uncover, even with demand response, or for using storage better, if you could have a lot of the smart data from all the smart meters. So I think that's really going to help reduce leakage, reduce losses, ensure, I'd say, timely cash flow and payments for the already very badly hit discoms and the utility sector. And it's also going to provide a lot of rich consumer insights into usage patterns, which will drive further efficiency, in my opinion, in the energy space. Sticking to the RE space on the utility side, again talking about very positive news. The recent news that has emerged out of large utilities globally that lead RE charge, especially in the US and in Spain. We've seen two examples. I think you've seen Nextera announced last week. They've had a great first quarter and they don't see any impact. Probably see zero impact of COVID on their business. They're still on track to do about 5 gigawatts this year, and they've already added about a gigawatt and a half to their pipeline the first quarter in the US. And they're also actively on the spree to acquire assets and projects and consolidate the space. Same as the announcement from Iberdrola, which is one of the largest utilities in the world by a measure, and also the largest in Spain. So they've also stated that there's going to be very little impact of COVID on their plans, progress of pipelines, and I think that's very heartening to note. Now, if you talk about India, also we're talking about positive news. We've again heard last week companies such as IndiGrid, which is KKR backed. They've also said that they are actively looking out in the markets to buy renewable energy assets in India, especially with sovereign offtake contracts like the one signed with NTPC, SECI, and the stuff. And it is said that they will remain very active in deal making all through COVID. So this is extremely positive sign, I think, for people who are in the industry and who are associated with the industry in any form and shape. In fact, I think we'll see this trend emerge. With this, with the larger IOUs, as you call it in the US, the investor-owned utilities, as also with some of the regulated utilities. Most of them will invest very strongly into renewable energy and other grid edge areas in this period. When I say this period, it's going to be not just a few quarters, but even a few years. And they'll keep an eye for consolidating the downstream sector through either platform buyouts or asset purchases. And I think we all know that and this is an old paradigm that always find itself true in crises like these. That for the ones with cash, this is probably the best time for deal making. So I think we're going to see that. We're going to see that deal making spirit back, at least with some of these large utilities that we've seen so far.
That's a good summary of both the positives and the negatives of this sector, both mobility, energy, and that's a good way to put it. But in your response, you also mentioned about a couple of points that companies and sector would probably look at trade-offs. The government agencies would look at trade-offs, and there will also be some regulatory changes or regulatory focus areas, policy focus areas come into play. And the other thing about the developmental agencies, the UNs, the IFCs, and all this will kind of see take a back seat, or the funding to those agencies also drop, so that the projects down the line that they are funding will also drop. Now this perfectly leads me to the next question, because all these agencies were kind of leading the charge when it comes to getting the Paris agreement in place, or encouraging companies and countries and cities to set targets, sustainability targets in place. Now with all this happening, now will the targets and other things be actually like a trade off for all the companies, cities, and countries?
So let's get this straight. I think broadly, I'd like to believe that everyone who's already committed to the climate agreements and the targets under those will try to do their best with very little delinquency. But I think the ones who always probably wanted to wriggle out and probably have signed under some form and shape of compulsion will probably find COVID as a very valid and good reason to pull out. And you can't blame some of these signatories much, right? Even if they pull out, what can you do? I mean, they'll have a very perfect reason to say that COVID's damaged my economies. I think when we think of clean energy targets, it's very pertinent to discuss the why and how of this. So why will companies break this, or even countries break this to break these targets, and how do you see this happening, if it is happening, or how on the other side, if they are actually going to be catering to it, how are they going to do it? So let's tackle the why first. I think looking at the ground reality is very clear that the broader shift of energy towards electricity from gas and oil is a done deal. It's cast in stone. So this is exactly the reason why you see large oil majors over the last maybe about roughly about 2 years, or maybe even 3 years. You've seen the largest oil majors in the world, like Shell, BP, Total, all of these large oil majors entering the electricity space, right? And the reason is very simple. I mean, I saw one of these BNEF analyst research notes, which basically plot, the possible growth that will be charted by different forms of energy, and electricity is just shooting through the roof in the next 30 years. So it basically means that electricity is going to be the single most used form of consumption of energy across the globe. And that's one of the reasons why you see all of these oil majors shifting focus from gas, oil into electricity much before the pandemic hit, much before the oil prices went low, right? So we've already seen that happen. As of last week, there was also significant development. Couple of Japanese banks, Mizo and Jibik, which are probably one of the last ones financing coal projects, basically thermal power projects globally, or even fossil fuel power projects globally, because there are a few of these fossil fuel technology providers from Japan. These financing providers have actually said that they're going to shut shop. They're not going to finance any new, thermal assets or fossil fuel assets, which only means better days for renewable energy. So I think these are signs that we should read for, why the targets will be met eventually. The other signpost that you could also have seen last week is this announcement coming from Equinor, which is the state-owned oil major in Norway. It became the first oil firm globally to pull back dividends for the very first time in its history, and I think also probably for the very first time we've ever heard, in this whole world, oil firms pulling back dividends for the very first time in their history, because it was always assumed that investing in an oil firm is basically a dividend for life, yeah, dividend for life kind of investment. But this has actually turned the leaf. So bear in mind that this will have a very deep implication for all of those who look at oil, and this probably can be seen as a Fukushima moment for oil, in my view. So both, I think the oil WTI prices going below zero, as well as the fact that some of the oil companies have also pulled back in terms of dividends, is to be seen as a Fukushima moment, in my view, as far as oil is concerned. Now, going to the how of the meeting the climate target perspective, again there are two critical parts to this particular thing: the supply side and the demand side. So when I say supply side, we're talking about financing, budgets of various countries, and the technology, right, that's available to do these things. And on the demand side, we're talking about companies and utilities which are committing to reduce the emissions. On the supply side, the notion that seems to be prevalent is that we can only continue on this path and meet the targets if there is a massive green stimulus. Now, this is not the case for every country, I believe, but at least some of the larger developed economies have come out of this shrill cry of wanting to have $1 trillion stimulus for green energy, or so on and so forth. While the idea of stimulus might be right, I think the timing might not perhaps be the right one at this moment. Because in the larger scheme of things, what gains priority, as I've repeatedly said during this conversation, is health and livelihood for people. So I don't say that it's wrong to ask, but I think probably the idea of a stimulus, even from the government's perspective, is probably not at the top two or three priorities for the sector, given the timing. While developed nations can think of immediate fiscal stimulus, at least you could have a Green New Deal discussion in the US. I don't think emerging markets will have that cushion or that sort of comfort. They can't even discuss those things. They can't fathom these fiscal stimuluses for green energy, simply because they have to keep the economic lights on as far as emerging markets are concerned. So I think sectoral demands could probably take a backseat at this stage. But in the absence of direct stimulus, what could actually help still meet these targets is that there could be a lot of regulatory interventions that can be attached to fiscal support being provided to the sectors that are actually beneficiaries of these stimuluses. So let's say, for example, one sector that we all know, which is affected globally at this stage because of the pandemic. I think it's very clearly known that airline industry is undergoing a severe stress at this stage, and most countries, including India, might have to bail out. So I think it's comical that we've moved from a situation where we were trying to privatize an airline, and probably now we'll end up owning, nationalizing a few airlines in India. So time can change so fast and things so fast. So that's what we've seen. So I think the question will be, let's say if the airline industry is getting a bailout, the question to ask there pertinently would be, can the governments accompany that bailout with a stiff emission reduction goal? So all of these airline firms, at least the ones in the developed nations, have committed to some emission reduction norms for airlines, but that's by 2050. The question is, can we advance those timelines from 2050 to, let's say, 2030 or 2035? And can we bring in a certain percentage of investments that should come from these industries into promoting, let's say, clean energy or adoption of electrification of transportation? That's one way of getting a regulatory intervention through an unrelated sector. The other way of getting a regulatory intervention from a related sector is, let's say, for example, if you consider auto sector, and I think we'll have this discussion coming up soon in India as well. We've all seen what happened in the Volkswagen issue in the US long back, right? And that, I think, led to sizably increase of the electrification of the transportation market in the US. So two things actually helped a lot. One is, I think, the growth of Tesla, and at the same point of time, the Volkswagen scandal. I think those were two important levers for e-mobility to probably skyrocket in US long back. I think the question, or sort of the point here, is that just as Volkswagen was asked to basically spend a sizable percentage in creating infrastructure for electrification of transportation, when they probably were given leeway to operate, could the same thing be done for the auto sector? Could the auto sector at different stages, at different parts of the value chain, commit to investing a specific size or amount over a period, and probably also commit to releasing a specific number of models per year, or maybe infrastructure, building infrastructure every year? These are I think critical goals that could be accomplished if you can have a regulatory intervention attached to fiscal support provided to related and non-related industries. Same applies, I think, in my opinion, for industries that pollute, especially the ones we've seen that are riverside. It was really hurting me when I saw some of these videos where in India, for example, the river Ganges is running super clean, right? When you could really see pebbles and stones, from the video itself. And it shows that most reasons for some of these river pollutants were just the industries operating alongside. So the question was, could you attach some of the targets there for those industries as you revive those industries back? I think while on that point, we're indeed very, very fortunate in India that we're actively debating an amendment to the Electricity Act that I believe is firmly rooted in the path of getting to that 450 gigawatt clean energy goal to be achieved by 2030. I think if you see some of the amendments proposed to the Electricity Act, There are various comments from various stakeholders. Some have called it far overreaching. Some have called it authoritarian. But I think there are quite a few of decent pointers within that amendment proposed, which are, I think, indicators of extremely good reforms that the sector never had in the first place. So I think fast tracking interventions like those, in terms of passing those bills quickly from both the houses, besides formation and award of private distribution licenses to operate within the state led discoms, it will also help in some of these regulatory interventions, helping say the country, the state, as well as company meet these targets. So in my view, if you look at the whole question of if and whether companies and countries will meet these targets, this would be my response in terms of looking at this from different perspectives and figuring out that we're not going to really lose much in the bargain.
That's a very good response, and it's very, very well justified. I mean, the points that you make, because emerging markets, for example, they definitely have to take care of the bigger priorities in hand, and they can't afford to have stimulus packages for clean energy or sectorial packages. But of course, the case like airline industry is something that I'm sure every government will definitely consider, because they have been the worst hit in the entire crisis. But looking at this, Wish, I mean, I kind of got your answer, but I would still want to pose this as a different way. Can we then conclude that business as usual, without consideration for climate change, will happen in some places, but overall, since the technology is kind of little mature, that wouldn't happen in most places? Like, for example, the developed countries, business as usual without consideration for climate change can't happen, but emerging markets, we can't help but in the next few years that will happen.
That's a very good question, and I think it's very relevant because people always, feel we are discussing about the present and the past, but people also need to hear from us what do we think of the immediate future, because they all need to return back to their businesses and their work, right? And it's a very critical question, especially for people who believe, especially in some of the districts in India, for example, that the lockdown might be lifted soon and they might return to work. They might probably want to understand. Will it be business as usual? Could we still be on the same track of controlling emissions even if we are on business as usual track and stuff like that? I think to answer this better, what I would like to do is to go back to a recent reading that hit my eye. When I was reading some of the institutional investor reports, especially in the clean energy space. It was basically a report from a large private equity group, and I came across this insane graphic that I think was sourced from NASA studies, where they plot the ceiling of CO2 emission norms, so CO2 emissions in parts per million across the life of the Earth. So you have this graph which is very interesting, where it's covered how the CO2 emissions panned out graphically. 100,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, 600,000 years ago, probably a few million years ago, stuff like that. And what I saw very interestingly, there were two observations which actually startled. One is that the emission levels that was there, at least on that particular chart, were never over 300 ppm anytime in the millions of years that the Earth has seen so far, right? Each time it probably went to about 200 to 300 ppm, and then it would come down. There could be there possibly, I'm assuming, there would be some catastrophic event that brought that down significantly down to less than 200, and then it would again go up, right? So it was probably sort of a V-shaped curve every time, every 100,000 years. Two, at the start of 2020, if you see where we are, from CO2 ppm perspective, we are already past the 400 mark. So at this stage, I think, honestly speaking, we are ahead, ahead of the ceiling of the CO2 emissions in ppm at any given point of time in human history, if you look at that particular chart. And it's also soaring. It's not just that, yeah, so this particular event, as I said, has probably brought down about 20% reduction in emission, and therefore subsequently some reduction in CO2 emissions in ppm. But that clearly is not enough. I think we still, even if you measure post lockdown, you would probably be around that mark. So clearly we cannot allow this to continue. And I think the one clear thing that this gives us as a message is that the business as usual can definitely not be the way forward, because I think, for all we know, as we've already spoken about that in this conversation earlier as well, that the next pandemic could be very well influenced by climate change. Now, this pandemic that we are in right now was predictable. It was warned. We were warned for years, and it's not that it came and hit us without warning. what I think was a black swan event, as most people say, is actually the lockdown, and the subsequent sort of economic actions, which will probably be a black swan event rather than the pandemic itself. But if you go back to climate change, I think the scientists have also been warning about this for many, many years, right? I mean, we've seen multiple reports coming out that, oil firms had studied about this maybe when about 30, 40 years back itself. But obviously, things were not at the right point to take off, and it did take off as far as controlling emission norms is concerned over the last decade. But the repercussions of the pandemic are simply not linear and unthinkable at this point of time. And hence, there can definitely not be any business as usual scenario. So, if it's not linear, if the repercussions of, let's say, the COVID pandemic is not linear and unthinkable, how can you expect, the repercussions of the next pandemic to be linear and unthinkable? So, I think you're basically going to see that business as usual is not the way to go about it. Now, once we've said that, we also need to talk about what's in it for the world to gain from continuing to invest into avoiding a climate crisis or a climate-led health crisis, I would say. If we go by, let's say, the recent IRENA report that came up maybe about 2 weeks back, it speaks about a very interesting stat. It talks about investing in renewable energy giving the world gains on global GDP of roughly close to $100 trillion. I think to be precise, they're talking about $98 trillion in the next 30 years. So you basically have $100 trillion of GDP to gain across the world over the next 30 years if you continue to invest in renewable energy. And if you talk about returns, and this is exactly where it makes very interesting reading or listening for a lot of listeners from the financial sector. Uh, the IRENA report also talks about a return of $3 to $8 on every dollar invested on clean energy or renewable energy. So, besides this, from the livelihood perspective, which is typically the socio-political angle, and I think the angle that is interesting most politicians is how many jobs can you create. The report also talks about quadrupling of the number of jobs. So you're probably at about 10 million jobs right now. You're talking about quadrupling that number to about 42 million jobs by 2050, right? So you are measurably improving global health if you're doing this. You are measurably improving welfare scores, and you're going to measurably improve the whole state and health of the global GDP if you're going to be investing into this. So I think there is absolutely no reason to not continue to invest, having heard and now seen the stat. And also, I think from the practical perspective, I think most listeners, all the stakeholders in the industry, as well as the government stakeholders, I'm sure everybody would have seen these videos of clean, unpolluted roads. During the lockdown, they would have seen very interestingly the kind of energy movements. The very low peak power demands in some of the urban cities that we've seen, and also the shooting up of residential energy usage, some very peculiar demands which are also something that we need to handle when we go towards handling renewable energy on larger scale. They've also seen all of these other videos around clean rivers, wildlife returning back to cities, I would say. Besides, I think very interestingly, a stat that is less spoken of, I think I have not heard of many people speaking of this over the last month, is the lower number of health issues reported. I mean, if you pick up any doctor in India today and ask them how many patients have they reported in the last couple of months, I'm pretty sure they'll say it was far lower than the normal numbers that they used to get every month, right? So when you started eating well, when you started living with your family at homes, and when you started avoiding unhealthy habits, I would say in general, you've also started lowering health issues. And I think transportation also has to do a lot. If you look at the stats that talk about deaths due to emissions in India, or so let's say pollution in India, it's a fairly large number of deaths due to pollution. So when you're not out on the streets, in the middle of vehicles that emit a lot of smoke, you are definitely doing your health a lot of good. And people have already seen the benefits of this in a short term. So this was a good pilot project, I would believe, to show how climate sustainability can extremely help you, to tide over all of these, crises. I think when it won't be business as usual for healthcare, for working, for traveling, or for your own jobs. Actually, after all this ends, I think it would be pointless to end that, or to think that we can stick to business as usual, for emissions, and not worry about continuing to invest. So I think that's my final take on this subject. I think if it's not BAU for healthcare, if it's not BAU for working, traveling, or any sort of thing after this crisis ends, I don't think it's going to be BAU for you know not investing and continuing to invest in clean energy. So I think we will continue to invest, in my opinion.
I really like the way you put this. I mean, the entire pandemic should be taken this as a pilot project for the bigger crisis that we can see if we don't invest in all the good technologies and prevent catastrophic occurrences from climate change. So that's a nice way to look at this scenario. Now, shifting gears again to the larger picture, the last few years, I mean, the other big thing that happened was scale picked up. And when I talk about scale in the clean tech space and the mobility space, most of the manufacturing happened in China. And because of the pandemic outbreak and everyone being very skeptical about China these days, and I'm sure you did mention about decentralization being the norm. Should manufacturing decentralization also be considered in a big way during this crisis? Will countries start looking at it that way as well?
Now, this is basically opening the Pandora's box, and I think this is going to be the real big question, real big debate, discussion that not only we are having on this particular conversation, but I'm pretty sure is the point of discussion across many economies, many countries, many governments at this stage. I'd believe that supply chain diversification is probably one of the biggest learnings from this crisis or from any sourcing crisis of any magnitude. We've already seen the kind of supply chain breakage, whether it's basically offshore, onshore. We've seen what happens when food doesn't hit the store near your house just because some shipments didn't happen the way they should probably happen. We also saw how a lot many firms found a lot many firms which operated very well, like a very well-oiled machine during peace times, found it very difficult to operate during these critical times. I think I've long maintained my stance on the 3Ds. I think 3Ds will definitely be outcome of this crisis: the decentralization, digitization, and decarbonization. And within that, I think decentralization of everything, including manufacturing, as a socio-political decision. Mind you, this word is very important. As a socio-political decision, will be a given because it's already seen, right? And even in India, you've seen the governments speak about, oh no, we are going to have to localize, the supply chain. So it's a socio-political decision first. The industry is yet to debate on it. The industry is yet to discuss on it. Now, whether it is successful or possible quickly, or even remotely possible, or is it going to be business wise to do that, remains to be seen. And I think that's where you will need involvement of a lot more stakeholders into this. So to put it in context for some of our listeners, I think we can bucket this into four areas that are pillars for a strong local manufacturing. I think the first one is supply chain efficiencies. Second is regulatory moat, in order that you as a country or an economy actually have something to guard for. The third is basically fiscal support, and the fourth is the control over resources. Right? I mean, these are the four different buckets that I would like to think of, or four pillars that I would think of for a strong local manufacturing. Supply chain efficiencies. Let's look at clean energy and the electrification of transportation industries. Let's understand very clearly that they are the work of tight yearly learning rates that have been gained on the ground, which are very clearly rooted in solid regulatory and state support as a productive moat. So, for any country to be able to unravel this and decentralize, even if that's a given outcome, as it is evident from this crisis socio-politically, it is not going to be an overnight affair. So, I think that's definitely a given. Next, let's say 24 to 48 months, or in the better part, let's speak about 2 to 4 years, we will certainly see urgent political action by governments across the world trying to form, let's say, level one regulations, which, in my view, and I see this happening, throwing, let's say, the cat among the pigeons right now, but I think this will definitely lead to some form of direct or indirect demise of the WTO norms, as we know. And this will, if this has to occur, if pure localization has to occur, you will have to at some form at some stage go against WTO norms. And what will then happen or then transpire is that you will see the return of FTAs. You will see a lot of return of free trade agreements on a country to country basis emerge. Now, how long some of those things take to formalize, what's in it politically, socially for countries, besides, I think industrially, is also to be seen. I think that could be long drawn affair. The basis for the localization moat that a country will draw, I think, will hugely depend upon how this pans out. So I think this is something which is very crucial. We're going to see this unfold probably in the next year to a couple of years, or maybe going up to 4 years if it forms FTAs. While it might be possible to regulatory wise and intent wise, manage this localization or maybe even think of this localization, fiscal support is a very big question. The third pillar that I spoke about, and it's a very big question given the economic situations of various governments. So it's one thing to say, I need to localize everything that's possible, and you may also end up doing it. I mean, politically, if you're really having a country with a clout or with a central government that has a clout, like what we have, for example, you may end up achieving certain level of localization. But the big question is, given the economic situation of a lot of governments globally, especially in emerging markets, emerging continents like, for example, Africa, and also parts of East Asia, we will need to think of some of the out of box ideas. I don't think the fiscal support by itself is going to be able to do this by itself. So there could be a lot of ideas around forming some sort of a sovereign climate. So when I'm speaking specifically with regard to clean energy and electrification of transportation, we're talking about, let's say, government is debating an idea of creating a separate sovereign fund which looks at just this space. We have a large infrastructure sovereign fund at the moment, without doubt, which does all sorts of infrastructure. But I think we could also think of a sectoral fund, or maybe a fund to drive manufacturing and entrepreneurship, to be able to localize to a certain extent. So, and this could possibly be, a game for ages. This could not be something that can be done overnight, but the thinking around this could certainly start soon. So you need to think of some of the out of box ideas as to what you could do to basically create that fiscal support. The last lever and the last pillar that I spoke about, which usually goes under the radar, is very, very critical. I think we also need to understand who, at the end of the day, has control of resources. So while you might be extremely gung ho and you might be extremely passionate about localizing the industry, I think we also need to understand, do we have the control over resources? And when I say resources, for clean energy, it's typically rare earth minerals that we're speaking about. The idea is to also understand, have we taken stock of what we have as deposits? Have we taken stock of how we are going to get those deposits out? Do we have free trade agreements with countries? I think India was, honestly speaking, ahead on this forefront as compared to a lot of other countries. It was actually actively signing agreements with South American countries for lithium. It was signing, I'd say, sourcing agreements with Australia, for example, again for the same matter. So the question would be to figure out, how much of control do you have on those critical resources? And mind you, I think this is also a period where we are seeing a lot of flux in unstable countries, right? We are seeing flux in countries like North Korea and Afghanistan, for example, which are very critical from the perspective of rare earths. I think if you look at these countries, they have huge deposits. One of the reasons why a lot of countries actually had an eye on some of these nations was also because of the kind of richness of content that they had with them. So it's also going to be important. And if you leave them apart, it's China and a couple of other countries. But China also has a hold on some of these countries from that perspective. So I think we also need to put all of these things into perspective. And modern day manufacturing might, or the modern day manufacturing strength, as you call, in sectors such as clean energy and electricity or electrification of transportation, is not solely due to manpower and manufacturing operation cost and scale. I think to an extent it plays a role without doubt, but we can't attribute everything to just manpower and manufacturing operations cost and scale. It's also a function of control over resources which are critical to the sector. I think this is one area where most governments would probably feel underprepared. Maybe India might be prepared. I'm not really sure, but I'm pretty sure a lot of the governments globally would see themselves underprepared if they actually make a very honest assessment, as they lost a lot of years, over the last decade, while it was just probably one or two states who were very super meticulous in planning how to gain control over resources. So I think that's going to also be a very important pillar to consider when we're talking about how we're looking at strong, so making our local manufacturing strong. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's a Pandora's box to open. It's a debate which will be endless in my view. But I think we will see in the next couple of quarters as to how this discussion and debate emerges out of boardrooms, out of, let's say, government offices and the ministerial offices. And I think it will, in my view, it will be bloody. It will have a lot of bloodshed. It will be led by, I'd say, a lot of political might rather than a lot of industrial will, if I can put it that way.
That's definitely a valid point. I'm sure at the scale, people will just start thinking about what are the options available, and only then probably later realize that they are probably a little underprepared. So I'm sure governments will be taking a good note of all this. So, Vish, what do you think are the lessons that companies need to take, looking at the crisis, observing the crisis, so that they are better prepared facing the other challenges that could come along in the next few decades?
So, okay. At the cost of not appearing to play a role of a career psychologist or an oracle, I think let me bring in a playbook that is easy to remember for the listeners, and possibly, I hope this will be helpful for our listeners from the industry or aspiring to be in the industry. This is something that I've personally benefited from, not only in this crisis. I think this is also a reflection of learnings over the years in the interim period, and I've also observed it. Parts of it, I would say, rather, or pieces of it in implementation or already in action by a lot of other companies in this crisis period, and also a lot of other individuals that I respect and I look up to, perhaps in different shapes and forms. But in order to weather this crisis, I've seen this used by people in different shapes and sizes. I've tried to amalgamate all those learnings and practice, and I've tried to condense it into a framework that's very easy to remember. And you can't really not talk about frameworks if you're talking about being consultant. So the whole idea is to look at this entire crisis and understand what lessons can we learn, and be more resilient as we move forward. And for that, I think we can just have a very simple framework called as calm. So when I say calm, which basically consists of CALM, I'm basically using it to first get the viewers and the listeners calm, so that you understand what this is all about. Each letter basically has a meaning behind an action that you could take. So the first thing, and the reason why it starts with C, is that we talk about control. The idea is to understand what's in your control, what's not. Do not to fret about what's not in your control, and do most things right about what's in your control. So this sounds like a sermon which will be available with a lot of spiritual gurus, but that's not what this is all about. If you go and deep dive on practical examples, for example, you couldn't do much, I couldn't do much about the lockdown imposed on us, right? I mean, as I think honorable citizens, we just have to adhere to what the government says, and I think that's basically the morality of being a good citizen at the end of the day. So I think you can't resist the lockdown. You can't resist the supply chain issues that are imposed on you because of that, whether as a business or as an individual, sustaining with a family. At the end of the day, the lockdown has brought in a lot of other critical aspects into play, which were not in your control. And I think you had to accept and figure out. So the idea is not to think of those things that you can't control. You can't control not shutting down your office. You can't control not operating. If you look at a larger picture, you couldn't have, let's say, as an oil company, you couldn't have done anything about the negative WTI contracts last week. As an airline industry, you couldn't have done about the loss of air travel because everybody randomly shut airports, all the governments shut air travel for a good purpose, honestly. Instead, I think it'll be great if lessons learned would have been from the perspective of companies putting their thoughts around what they can control. And I think not only in this crisis, if they could have done this even the last decade, we would have been in a much better place. The companies and the individuals might have themselves been in a much better place in terms of either having a cash reserve to operate for. I think this peculiar thing that I observe, which actually gets on me, especially when you look at the financial market situation, is that we're seeing a lot of companies say they can't pay salaries for 1 month, right? And what good have you done to running a business for multiple years or across the years if you can't have a cash reserve for paying the people that much richly deserve all of that success that you owe them back? And I think this basically shows that the world has become so interconnected, so less efficient, so super efficient, not less efficient, actually super efficient in terms of managing cash flows, that you don't even figure out how you can manage to be afloat by paying, let's say, by having a reserve of, let's say, 5 to 6 months to be able to take care of your employees. I know it's difficult for MSMEs. I know it's difficult for small scale industries because the small ones are basically hand to mouth. But to hear that large industries, large companies which are listed in the stock market, large caps, say they're going to run a show where they can't really keep the same number of employees on roll for even 1 month, is really stark. I think it talks about a lot of things which are not normal with the way we've been running our show in the world. And I think those are things that you can control. The questions that companies need to ask and the lessons that they need to learn is about how are you running your business. Does it require pruning costs? Does it require you to keep a cost reserve? So if you really budget for cost reserves, are you really operating at the right margins? Is there any point in cutting down margins to an extent that you can't even live and support your, let's say, your most prized asset in the company, which is your resource or your human resource? How would you really start after you come out of the lockdown? So I think these are all critical things that are under your control, and you can definitely do something about that. So I think that's the first step as far as C of the calm is concerned. The second point that I want to mention here is about the letter A, which talks about how you adapt to the situation. Now, if you can't do much about the lockdowns, you need to adapt. For instance, if you talk about, let's say, a large number of clean energy developers, solar developers, and I think this was mentioned in some of the quarterly earning calls of large utilities like Nextera, Iberdrola, all of these guys, where they said that they are going to basically figure out solar developers who are not doing well or wind developers not doing well, and they're going to probably acquire them. Now, as a solar developer or as a wind developer, you will need to also figure out, how you go about your CAS and CAC, which is basically customer acquisition as well as customer acquisition cost. How are you going to go about that? Conducting your business, work from home, using online methods. I think these are critical things for you to adapt to because you don't have an option right now. You can't really take those flights or those transport means that you had earlier. You'll have to figure out how you'd be able to achieve more with less travel, maybe equal, if not more, team output with social distancing, even if you're at the office or if you're not at the office. How do you critically deal with this challenge if you're operating through Zoom calls or stuff like that? If you're a part of the upstream space, whether it's clean energy or whether it's electrification of transportation, I think it's also critical for you as a company or as individuals to figure out how you'll be able to localize supply chain. This is something we spent a lot of time on in this conversation. So I think it's very prudent to also figure out how you're going to adapt to localize supply chain if there is, a sort of an imposition, or I would say sort of a natural requirement for the country to localize supply chains to the best possible extent, while you also minimize supply chain issues for your own company, for your own customers, and you keep the costs and the project times and deliveries down once things normalize. The L of calm is something that I lead to in terms of learning and leading in uncertainty or taking decisions in uncertainty. I think we all realize that as humans, we are inherently programmed to take decisions in uncertainty. I think that's something we need to really understand. We've learned right from childhood that, whether it was about deciding between different candies or deciding between different friends at school or even between different choices for options in colleges, right now to choices at work. I think we've been programmed to take decisions in uncertainty. So I think as humans, we should not be really worried about that fact. When we take this opportunity to reactivate this key during this crisis, this is a dormant characteristic that is lying ready to be awakened in each one of us. I think we should probably not stop at just making decisions in uncertainty, but I think we should also continuously learn while adapting, which is going to be a key to be resilient in such crises going forward. So this will not only provide opportunity for success, I believe, as we start learning and take decisions in uncertainty, and most of those decisions pan out successful or maybe not a disaster, you will also create a fertile base for new innovation in processes or products that you're involved in. It's because if you pick out history, you'll figure out that some of the largest companies, the largest tech companies, most of them have actually burst out of recessions previously. So, like, if Amazon and Google survived 2000s, they became, the tech giants in the last decade. So, you have world domination waiting for you if you can actually innovate and be one of those companies that really come out of this unscathed. And that's what L stands for. I come to the last letter M, which basically also talks about motivation and also feedback. I think in the recent poll that I came across from the Kaiser Family Foundation, which was tracking national health in the US, 56% of the respondents said that they were all feeling stress and in some form of depression, right? And it's very common in this kind of a pandemic. It's very common to have those characteristics. Another 55% of people who took the poll also said that they had already lost their jobs, and probably maybe about tens of other percent of people who took the polls We're also expecting that they'll lose their jobs, post the economy coming back to shape. I think this is a frank reality of the whole situation. I think employment numbers we've already seen are in tens of millions in the US. It's not going to be very different. It's easily extrapolatable to the rest of the world, and it's not going to be very different for developed nations. In fact, it's going to be, worse because we don't have formal employment to measure. We have a lot more of informal employment in our country and some of the East Asian economies as well. And we can expect that the situation is not going to be very different from different parts of the world. The situation therefore mandates that as a team member or as a leader, you need to take leadership to be able to motivate the people around you, the team around you, and not just talking about business, but even workers, families, family members, friends around you, even family friends for that matter, to help soft land on this particular tragedy. To be able to get them to shape, but at the same point of time, also take care that you're not faking reality to all of these people. So there's no point in faking reality to please them, because when it hits them hard, it's going to hit you back, as far as business or work is concerned, or as family is concerned. So I think it's absolutely clear that you should be able to spend some time, even when you're sitting with the family. And I do that with my family, or I've seen that others also do with their families, to be able to have frank chats and to be able to say what's going to happen after this, right? Because everybody is equally curious as to what's going to happen. These are unprecedented times, and I don't think I think not many millennials or our Gen Next are programmed to handle the depression or anxiety or stress that will come about from thinking about whether one's job would remain, or whether there would be opportunities as an entrepreneur, or whether one may contract the disease, God forbid, the worst case scenario, and even what could happen to the family if all these situations remain. I think this is exactly where you need to activate the individual leadership, the authentic leadership inside you, and play a big role in keeping your mindset in the right place in the first to start with, and then also be able to pull out others from the depths of the depression. And finally, as you do all this and roll out your action plans for work post COVID, I think it's helpful to also measure some of these actions or steps that you've devised, if they're providing you real benefit or not. And if they are not, then fine tune them accordingly as you go. So everybody is right now building a airplane as they're flying it, as you call it. And I think that's exactly where we are, and we need to fine tune as we are flying this aircraft. And I think we can achieve this with a calm mind and with a calm framework. I would say I believe most individuals and companies can weather any future crisis if you just use frameworks like these.
That's a wonderful framework, Vish. And it clearly shows that as an entrepreneur, you're thinking of the bigger picture. And an entrepreneur, from my view, is an eternal optimist. And crisis like this brings the best out of him. And the framework and the thinking behind it clearly shows that you're well prepared, and you're actually enabling others also to be well prepared by sharing this in a platform like this. So thank you for that. So, on a final note, if I were to ask, should we consider then the entire crisis is like a blessing in disguise?
I think given what we've seen and we've experienced over the past couple of months, at least in India, and I think we've been tracking this whole development around the world over the last 3 to 4 months, there is absolutely no doubt that this crisis is going to leave us more strong-willed to effect change than we ever were probably in the last 80 years, since the last industrial revolution, right? I think leaving aside the humanitarian side of the crisis and the loss of lives and livelihood, as which is unfortunate. But as an eternal optimist, I do think this crisis was a blessing in disguise. I think we can only go better from here on. Just like the post-war industrial revolution, if you go back to the late 1940s, I do believe that there is a big revolution awaiting. In the way we work, a big revolution awaiting for us, in terms of the way we earn our living, the way we live life, and possibly the way we interact with others. Given social distancing and so many other things emanating out of this, it's poised to undergo a sea change thanks to this event. And I think I have no doubt we'll be fully prepared for the post COVID revolution and the growth phase, thanks to the tolerance and calmness that I think all of us have seem to have inculcated. And we've also probably displayed during this period. I think one of the things that go least said, also probably least understated, is the fact that a country of 1.3 billion was shut down and we didn't have riots for 40 days, right? Whatever may happen now from here on is a different thing in history. But I think if you talk about a country with about 1/7 of the world population, is straight away going into lockdown and unannounced, unprepared, and most of the public taking it really, really sportingly, talks about the tolerance and the calmness inherent in us as human beings in this country. And I think also something that we've inculcated, something that we've sharpened and displayed during this period. That said, I think the other thing that we've also seen, and which I come back to again and again, because those are scenes that probably would never leave me for my life, for my lifetime. The rivers that were otherwise polluted by industrial and human waste, they started running clear the last few weeks. Animals which were rarely seen in the wilderness of jungles are now seen, in the main roads and streets. They're reclaiming they're reclaiming their land and their assets, which was actually duly theirs for a very, very long time. And now they are frequently spotted in urban neighborhoods or freeways. Emissions have dropped by a record. We've spoken about that on the land, air, and sea. And I think to believe, and if I have to sum this on a positive note, these are just a glimpse of a beautiful future, one where nature feels one with us, that beholds us if we walk the sustainable path of climate safety and preservation. Now, the choice of whether to choose this path or to keep doing what we knew best will stare at us the day this crisis ends. And this time, I think we better hope that sanity prevails and we choose the right option.
That's a wonderful way to put it and sum it up, Vish. So it's really been an absolute pleasure having this chat with you, because I've known you for quite some time now. And whenever we talk, we generally talk about the sector in short, and we ask about, okay, what's the sector doing? What can we expect in the next 6 months? But when I wanted to have this chat with you, we clearly said, like, okay, this is a bigger picture. There's a bigger crisis happening. So what are the different ways in which we should look at it? So I'm really glad that the conversation has covered this in very depth, and you have provided references wherever it's needed. So I'm sure anyone who's listening to this will know the depth of work that you put in, research that you put in, the way that you're seeing it as an entrepreneur yourself will be clearly visible to anyone who listens to this. So thanks for taking time to do this. It's been an absolute pleasure to have known you, and getting to have such kind of conversations from time to time with you to understand this perspective. So thank you very much for joining me on this podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Girish, to be on this conversation on this podcast. And I've been following the podcast and some of the other episodes as well. I think you've been doing a really good work in terms of getting some of the most non-vocal issues in the clean energy and sustainability space across. So I think, firstly, thank you for that as a supporter of this particular space and sector. And of course, I think anything that helps anybody else, because I think at this point in time, all of us are undergoing the same set of feelings, the same set of emotions, probably also the same set of experiences. And I think the only way in which you can come through crisis unscathed or with probably very little effects is if you share and also share and probably also learn through the learnings of others. So I'm more than happy to have this conversation with you, and thank you for inviting me once again.
And yes, I definitely enjoyed recording the podcast with Vish. Hope you enjoyed the chat as much as I did. There was definitely some amount of caution, but a lot of ideas and optimism. Quite a few interesting nuggets like the calm framework and the 3D of decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization. Even during these times, there are positive news like Vish mentioned. Global utilities have announced that there is going to be minimum impact of COVID-19 on their business, and the pipeline and deal making will remain very active by large utilities during this time. But on the other side, climate change is likely to be the next pandemic. So the way we react to the current situation will decide how we prepare for the next pandemic. Key questions like how will countries keep up pace with the progress in the climate movement? Will the transition pathways be different for the emerging economies versus the developed countries? And how can governments provide stimulus to businesses? And if yes, can it be with strong strings attached to ensure climate justice? But one thing is quite clear. Business as usual cannot be the answer at this point in time. So let's hope we make the right choices. You can reach out to Vish by following him on LinkedIn. You can search for Vish Iyer. Or you can also follow him on Twitter. His handle is V Iyer Says. Of course, the links to connect with him are in the show notes section of the podcast. And all the references to the studies and market data that Vish mentioned can be found on the podcast page of this episode on missionchunia.com. And you can follow Mission Chunia again on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. The handle is @MissionChunia. 2 weeks from now, we'll have another conversation, another story, and again related to the current situation around COVID-19. So please do subscribe to get notified when it is released. And if you have been following Mission Chunia, Why not spread the word? It just takes about 30 seconds to share the podcast to 3 people in your network. So please consider doing that. And with that, signing off, this is Girish Shivakumar and thank you for listening.